Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class, a production of iHeartRadio. Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Holly Fry.
And I'm Tracy V. Wilson.
It's the last week of October.
Uh-huh.
Not all of our October episodes have been as Halloween-y as they might historically have been.
Yeah, I would say it's typical to have some non-Halloween-y episodes, but it has felt a little thinner this year than
It's because
typical.
usually all of mine are very Halloween-y, and they haven't all been very Halloween-y, and I feel like I've failed. So, it's Ghost Week. I'm trying to make it up to everybody. So all ghosts all the time. According to an article that was written by Mike Wade for The Times in 2009, quote, in Britain, around a third of people say that they believe in ghosts, and 1 in 10 claims to have seen one. And that got me thinking that the British Isles sure are full of ghost stories. So all week long, we're doing Ghosts of the British Isles. It's our wrap up to Halloween season, and I thought, it would be a cool thing to do a 2-parter that collects assorted ghost stories of the British Isles, which I sort of did, but I also kind of messed up because I only got to 3 of them. Because in doing the research, I got so involved in seeking out info and trying to flesh out some things that I realized had gotten dead-ended in a lot of the telling that I filled up 2 episodes with just 3. So the first episode deals with 2 very ghosty ghost tales. They are ghost stories. The first one takes about 2/3 of the episode, and then the second takes about the last third. And then the second episode of the week will be an examination of a 17th century poltergeist story. So they can stand each on their own, but we're still grouping them together as a 2-parter as our sort of October finale. So welcome to Ghost Week.
First, we have the Brown Lady of Raynham Hall, and that's a spirit we've talked about on the show before. She was part of our Spirit Photography live show in 2019. And we'll have a little bit of crossover with that, but there is more to the Brown Lady haunting story than we could really include of that in the context of that show on a different topic.
Yeah. So first, we'll talk a little bit about Raynham Hall. For clarity, this is the Raynham Hall in Norfolk, England, not the one in New York, which has its own historical significance. But this Raynham Hall was built in 1620 by Sir Roger Townsend on a 7,000-acre estate. And it was at the time a unique structure in comparison to most existing manor houses in England at the time because it was built in the Italian style. It's this beautiful red brick building. It looks definitely different than others that were being built around the time.
More than 100 years later, the person living at Raynham Hall was Charles Townsend, 2nd Viscount Townsend, who came to be known by the nickname Turnip Townsend, and that was because he was interested in agriculture. He had been born at Raynham in 1674, and after a career in politics, that was where he returned to work on the farming projects. Turnip Townsend hired an architect named William Kent to make both exterior and interior renovations to the existing structure in the 1730s. One of Raynham's famous features is its ornate chimney pieces, and those were part of Kent's work.
But it is also with this Charles, and there are several Charleses, I apologize. Charles Townsend is a name that gets repeated throughout the family tree. But it is with this Charles that the haunting story begins, or rather, really with his wife, Lady Dorothy Walpole. She was the sister of Robert Walpole, considered the first British Prime Minister, so the Walpoles are hot topics this Halloween season on Stuff You Missed in History Class. As you'll remember, we just covered Horace. And the story here is that Dorothy haunts Raynham Hall to this day. But the details regarding her life have kind of taken on a life of their own.
The classic and often repeated version of Lady Townsend's story is that Charles treated her terribly. And this is in line with the reason that people give for Dorothy haunting the estate. She's trapped there, maybe seeking some kind of retribution or understanding. This version of the story is that Charles had a temper And he either learned that Dorothy had been unfaithful to him or that she'd been romantically involved with someone else before they were married. A popular version is that Dorothy, who was known to be a spender, had angered Charles by just frittering away huge amounts of money.
She and Charles have their own additional complicated backstory. They're said to have been childhood sweethearts, but that the Walpoles did not agree to a match. So Charles married another woman, that was Elizabeth Pelham, and they had a family together. A big family. Some reports say they had 10 kids, while others say that it was 5, and this might reflect the remainder of them having died in childhood. But when Elizabeth died, Charles and Dorothy were finally able to marry, which they did in 1713, and they too had a lot of kids. Perhaps 11. Similarly, in Charles's obituary, it states that he and Dorothy had 4 sons and 2 daughters. So obviously that does not add up to 11. And that discrepancy in numbers remains a mystery. Like the other one, they may have lost children at a very young age. But after 13 years of marriage in 1726, Dorothy contracted smallpox and died.
But rumors sprang up that she was not, in fact, dead, and she was instead a prisoner at Raynham Hall, forbidden to go out or even see her own children. These rumors persisted, and as rumors often do, they expanded. Soon there were whispers that the funeral had been staged and that there was no body in her coffin, and that Charles had put together this deception so that he could keep her in the house, isolated and alone, as some kind of punishment. Some versions of the story say that she was starved to death, and others say she was pushed down the stairs by Charles and broke her neck.
In 1738, Charles Townshend died somewhat suddenly. According to a report in the Derby Mercury on Sunday, June 29th, 1738, on the preceding Wednesday, quote, after supper, his lordship returned to his room, apparently in good health. He rung his bell, and the servant going immediately up the stairs found his lord dead. His lordship had flung up the sash of the window as though he had done it for the sake of air. He was in the 64th year of his age.
There's a sighting of a ghost at Raynham that's sometimes included in the story and sometimes not, which is surprising because it involved royalty. This one involves King George IV, who was born in 1762 and visited Raynham while he was a young boy. In this story, he's said to have seen a pale woman in a brown dress looking disheveled, and this woman was in his room. He woke everybody up, and depending on which account you read, he either said he would not spend another hour in the house or that he wanted to change rooms.
The first widely reported ghost sighting at the hall wasn't until 1835 during a party, which, as was common for the day, included the invited guests sleeping over. And one of those guests, a Major Loftus, described encountering a female apparition while he was headed to bed in the wee hours of the morning. The woman he saw was wearing a brown silk dress and was standing on the landing on the stairs. Loftus called out to this mystery woman, who then vanished into thin air. He decided to try to corner the spirit, and once again he saw her, this time more closely. Loftus described a woman with a frightening countenance. Her eye sockets were empty. He drew what he had seen and shared his drawing with the rest of the guests the next day at breakfast, and this prompted the Charles Townshend, who was living there at the time, who was a descendant of Dorothy's husband, Charles Townshend, to admit that he and his family had also seen this specter. This information is said to have scared the house staff so much that all of them reportedly quit on the spot, and then that led the Townshend in residence to suspect that someone had actually been playing a trick by creating this ghost with the intent of creating havoc in his life. So he actually had a team of detectives investigate. But after 2 months of these detectives essentially living at Raynham Hall, they found nothing and they closed the case.
In a moment, we will talk about another account of an encounter with the Brown Lady. But first, we will have a sponsor break.
After the Loftus sighting, another guest saw the spirit, although the account we have of that event is from years later, even though it happened the year after Loftus saw the brown lady. In an 1891 account of the Raynham Hall haunting written by Florence Marryat in her book, There Is No Death, she describes another experience that happened at Sir Charles Townsend's house. Marryat claims in the text that her father learned about the story from Townsend, who at the time was his country neighbor.
Charles and his wife, once they took ownership of the Raynham Hall estate, had launched this huge renovation and redecorating project, and they brought a load of friends over to stay and party. But soon the guests started leaving one by one because of all the ghost sightings. They claimed to have seen a woman, quote, wearing a brown satin dress with yellow trim and a ruff around her throat. She's described as looking innocent and harmless, and her portrait, according to Marryat, also hung in one of the bedrooms.
The initial assessment of the situation was that this was a trick that was being played by poachers who would rather have the estate left unoccupied so that they could hunt the grounds there themselves, which they had apparently been doing before this whole renovation and party happened. So, to help, Marryat's father, Captain Frederick Marryat, who was a Navy officer and a novelist, offered to stay in the room where the brown lady's portrait hung because he believed he could catch the tricksters. He slept, his daughter wrote, quote, with a loaded revolver under his pillow. And after a couple of nights of seeing nothing, Frederick Marryat did see a woman in the hallway. And he was not alone. The host's 2 adult sons were with him. Captain Marryat discharged his weapon at the woman at close range after she had made like this menacing face at him, and she vanished. The bullet he fired lodged in a panel of the room opposite where he stood, and he was, after that experience, convinced that the apparition was real.
The Townsends occupied this estate for centuries, and in 1899, John Townsend, 6th Marquess Townsend, inherited it. At that point, though, the estate and the family were bankrupt, the estate was rented out, and the art collection was sold off. It wasn't until 1921 that he died and his widow moved in. The Marchioness Townsend, who was quite wealthy, decided that she would restore the house. But she also had another project related to the house, and that was a book about all of its various hauntings.
This is one of those details that does not seem to pop up a lot, that the owner of the house published a book about its various ghosts in 1936. But this seems pretty important, as you'll see. The Marchioness Gladys Townsend co-wrote the book with another writer, Maud Folks, who was a ghostwriter, excuse the pun, for a lot of wealthy society women who wanted to pen their memoirs or their family biographies. And I was not able to get my hands on a copy of the book in time for this episode. I presume it will get here today, right after we finish recording. It does, though, we know, include the story of the brown lady, Dorothy Walpole. And it seems, based on the brief excerpts that I was able to get a hold of online, that this might be the source of some of the speculative versions and the sort of dark, romanticized, and played up for dramatic effect versions of Dorothy's story.
So this all sets the scene for the famous photo of the brown lady. 2 men were assigned by Country Life magazine in 1936 to visit Raynham Hall and take photos of the estate. These 2 men were Captain Hubert Prevand and Indre Shira, who was Prevand's assistant. The official story is that when they were getting ready to take a photo of the building's main staircase, Indre Shira saw what he described as a vapory form that slowly took on the features of a woman floating down the stairs. When Shira exclaimed in shock, Prevand, who was under the camera's black cloth, jumped and snapped the photo and captured an image of the ghost in the process.
The magazine published the photograph on Boxing Day that year, December 26th, with the following as part of the introduction to the article about it. Quote, "A genuine case of spirit photograph has yet to be proved, those so far investigated either proving to be fakes or impossible to authenticate owing to the absence of witnesses. Yet the following account and illustration of what happened at Raynham Hall, Norfolk, the seat of the Marquess Townsend, deserves attention.
The account of what happened, as written by Indra Shira, is included next. Here's how he described how they snapped the photo. Quote, Captain Provand took one photograph of it whilst I flashed the light. He was focusing again for another exposure. I was standing by his side, just behind the camera with the flashlight pistol in my hand, looking directly up the staircase. All at once, I detected an ethereal, veiled form coming slowly down the stairs. Rather excitedly, I called out sharply, Quick, quick, there's something. Are you ready? Yes, the photographer replied and removed the cap from the lens. I pressed the trigger of the flashlight pistol. After the flash and on closing the shutter, Captain Provand removed the focusing cloth from his head and, turning to me, said, What's all the excitement about? I directed his attention to the staircase and explained that I had distinctly seen a figure there, transparent, so that the steps were visible through the ethereal form, but nevertheless very definite and to me perfectly real. He laughed and said I must have imagined I had seen a ghost, for there was nothing now to be seen. It may be of interest to record that the flash from the Sasha bulb, which in this instance was used, is equivalent, I understand, to a speed of 1/50th part of a second.
Shira's account goes on to mention that Provand didn't believe in spirits and actually bet Indra £5 that there was nothing on the image. But of course, when they developed it, there it was. Provand, according to Shira, allegedly never paid up. Shira noted, quote, I have neither his technical skills nor long years of practical experience as a portraitist. Neither am I interested in psychic phenomena. But I maintain that the form of a very refined influence was so real to my eyes that it must have been caught at that psychological moment by the lens of the camera.
Paranormal investigator Harry Price wrote the next segment of the piece in Country Life. Price explains, quote, It must be admitted that had the photographer first taken the stairs and, without moving the camera, introduced a draped figure into the picture by the double exposure method, an identical spirit picture would have been obtained. I asked to see the negative and, much more important, Mr. Indra Shira and his operator, Captain Provand. We duly met at their studio, and I was invited to cross-examine the photographers. I will say at once that I was impressed. I was told a perfectly simple story. Mr. Indra Shira saw the apparition descending the stairs at the precise moment when Captain Provand's head was under the black cloth. A shout, and the cap was off, and the flashbulb fired, with the result which we now see. I could not shake their story, and I had no right to disbelieve them. Only collusion between the two men would account for the ghost if it is a fake. The negative is entirely innocent of any faking.
So this famous paranormal investigator could not find evidence of trickery or foul play on Provand's and Shira's parts. But though that was good enough for a lot of people, the Society for Psychical Research was not convinced. In 1937, that organization did its own investigation, and it came to the conclusion that the alleged apparition in the photo was there because the camera was shaken or shifted during its exposure.
This photo has continued to garner interest in the nearly 90 years since it was published. There are still people who believe it is real, as well as skeptics who have picked it apart. To some, it looks as though there was an awkward shift in the way the lines of the staircase appear in the photo, or that there's a double exposure with some elements of the wall decor repeating just below their actual positions. But a clean image of the staircase shows that there is a sort of demi-landing halfway down. It isn't one continuous line from top to bottom, and there's a panel with trim that could easily be mistaken for a picture frame. There are some examinations of the height of the figure. She does look unusually short, and a number of people have noticed that the shape looks more like a statue of the Virgin Mary than an early 18th century woman in a silk nightgown.
But perhaps the most informative part of all this story is the timing. It does seem oddly coincidental that a photo of the brown lady would be snapped right after a book featuring her was released. by the owner of the property. One item of note is that the country living write-up never references the brown lady at all. It talks about the possible ghost in more general terms. And this is sometimes held up as some sort of proof that the photo must be genuine and that no one involved knew about the story of Dorothy Walpole Townsend. But that would just mean that the magazine that just published an entire spread on Marchioness Gladys Townsend and her home hadn't done a very thorough job of researching her life.
As to the rumors of why Dorothy Walpole might be haunting Raynham Hall, they also have problems. The story that Dorothy was held captive and that her funeral was all theatrics, those just don't actually hold up. In a statement to the BBC in 2009, the estate said, quote, "People said that Dorothy was locked away and badly treated. But in the 1960s, we uncovered paperwork and medical reports suggesting she had a happy life and was much loved. She does seem to have gotten treatment for her smallpox, even though that did not save her. Not actually effective treatment for smallpox when she was living. And if she was haunting the house at some point, she seems to have stopped. No one has claimed to see her since that famous photograph was taken."
Oh, Dorothy. We will get to another ghost in just a moment, but first we're going to hear from the sponsors that keep Stuff You Missed in History Class going. In 1625, on the northeastern coast of what's now Northern Ireland, that's known as the Antrim Coast, John Shaw of Greencock built a French chateau-style castle. Shaw did not own the land. He was, at the time, renting it from the Earl of Antrim, Randall McSorley MacDonald, at a rate of £24 per year. This area, incidentally, might look quite familiar to listeners if they watched Game of Thrones, because some exterior scenes were shot nearby. That whole coast is home to a lot of shooting locations.
The castle, as originally built, had a stream that ran through its outer hall and a tower at each of its four corners with a conical roof. The walls of this castle are also very thick, more than 1.5 meters, and this was definitely a place built for defense, protection, and thanks to that water source, survival. And that's because at the time that it was constructed, there was a lot of conflict happening in this area.
And that conflict had been going on since 1609. That was when King James I decided that residents of England and Scotland, and Protestants specifically, should move to the northern region of Ireland, which was at the time Catholic. Prior to this, that region was not exactly friendly for the king, so really this conflict goes back much farther than 1609. And he basically wanted to make sure that all of the areas of his kingdom were populated with people sympathetic and loyal to the crown in order to theoretically prevent any uprisings. And this effort to relocate Protestants is called the Plantation of Ulster. The Protestants who made this move were called planters.
But this was not, of course, as benign as just suggesting people move and then they did it. Even if it had been that benign, there were political reasons to suggest that people do such a thing. There was the financial component to the plan that also caused a lot of strife. To pay for moving a bunch of people, King James leaned on the wealthy companies and landowners of London. He made a deal with them that if they financed people moving, they could have large tracts of land in Ireland. But that land, of course, already had people living on it. So the king was seizing the land in an area known as Ulster to make this whole colonization thing work. And all of this tension was ongoing. So when John Shaw built his castle, those thick walls were considered imperative. Shaw was one of the people who moved to Ireland as part of the plantation. He had gotten there in 1613.
And in 1641, there was an attack on the castle by the Gaelic Irish who wanted to force out the Scots that were living there. This attack was ultimately unsuccessful. 39 years later, the castle was captured in 1680 by Irish chieftains, but their occupation was brief. They were wanted men and they were being aggressively pursued, and rather than stay and risk attack, they scattered into the surrounding woods.
But the political upheaval and battles are not the source of the Ballygally ghost story. It's Shaw's immediate family. Like most ghost lore, this one has several versions. The first is that shortly after finishing the castle, or even while it was being completed, James Shaw married a woman named Isabella Brisbane. Her first name gets spelled in a variety of ways depending on the source. Sometimes Isabella is also described as very young, maybe just 16 when the couple married.
Yeah, there are also versions that say that she came over with him, but there's such a gap that then she would have been much older by the time she got married and had kids. And so it just doesn't add up. This is one of those cases where you can tell that a lot of the lore has shifted and embellished. James's goal was to have kids. He wanted an heir, and several years into their marriage, Isabella gave birth to a child. But it was not the hoped-for son, and according to lore, James flew into a rage over it. He locked Isabella in a tower of the castle after taking her baby away and possibly killed the child. Lady Shaw was soon found dead on the ground outside of the tower. So in this version, the story is that she climbed out the window and jumped, hoping she would survive the fall and be able to get to her baby. Other versions suggest that she was killed by James or one of his allies.
Another version of the story, told by Jeff Bellinger in his 2009 book, World's Most Haunted Places, is that James discovered Lady Shaw had a paramour and that there was some doubt about who the father of the newborn was. And then in yet another somewhat sanitized version that's shared by the current owner of the castle, this baby was a boy, and James took it and locked Isabel up, and because he just had no more use for her once his heir had been produced.
Yeah, this is one of those things that Jeff Bellinger in particular is like, a lot of these versions of the story don't make sense because even if she had had a daughter, there's no reason they couldn't have tried again for an heir, for a male child. And even if he had a male child, wouldn't he want more male children so that they could ensure the bloodline? So it doesn't always really add up. But the castle, known as Ballygally, passed down through the family, and then it was privately sold and shifted through a number of hands over the centuries. It left the ownership of the Shaw family in 1799 when it was sold for £15,400. And then in the 1830s, the castle was used by the Coast Guard for a while as a rental property. They used it as a base of operations from which anti-smuggling efforts were initiated.
The castle was purchased in the 1950s by Cyril Lord, who had made his fortune in the carpet business. He was known as the Carpet King. Lord turned the castle into an inn called the Candlelight Inn. In 1966, the castle was purchased and updated by Sir Billy Hastings. It has been expanded. The old castle section remains, and there's also a newer section of it. Many elements of the original castle remain, including the original door. There's an inscription over the door that reads, 1625, God's providence is my inheritance. That inscription is not from 1625, though. It was put there in 1760 during renovations. There's also a coat of arms and the initials JS and IB for James and Isabella. The castle remains a hotel in the Hastings Hotels collection.
Throughout the years, there have been stories of multiple ghosts in the castle, and the hotel really leans into that lore. For one, Lady Isabella's tower room is maintained as her room. It's called the Ghost Room, and for a while you could rent that room, although the hotel has stopped letting guests stay there. The room has what is purported to be Lady Shaw's original bed, and while guests can't sleep there, they are encouraged to visit. There is actually very clear signage that leads visitors up the stairs and to the ghost room. Lady Shaw's story is on display on plaques, and many guests specifically request rooms in the old castle section, hoping that they might have an encounter with her. And there have been all of the classic reports of hauntings, so hot and cold spots, thumping noises, knocks at the door when there's no one in the corridor, etc.
There are reportedly other ghosts there, though. One of the ghosts is Madam Nixon. She was Shaw's sister-in-law and moved to Ballygally after she was widowed. People have described hearing what sounds like silk rustling in the hallways of the castle section, and that noise is attributed to Madam Nixon.
Employees have also stated that guests have heard the laughter of a child when there was no child present, as well as sensations of having someone touch them when there is no one in the room with them. There are stories of banquet tables that are set for an evening being disheveled before the guests have even arrived, and also a story of nuns having their Bibles fly off their dressers. In 2003, BBC presenter Kim Lenehan and her crew spent the night in Ballygally for a story leading up to Halloween, or at least they attempted to. A medium that the BBC had brought in reportedly contacted the spirit of a distressed woman, and as they conversed, Lenehan reported that the temperature in the room rose rapidly, accompanied by a musty vanilla smell. After the medium left and Lenehan tried to get some rest, she reported the smell coming back in the middle of the night, saying, quote, "It was a smell that almost covered you like a sheet." Kim asked to be moved to the newer section of the hotel.
Many, many people have had experiences that they describe as supernatural at Ballygally, but the good news is none of those have been violent. So if there are spirits there, they don't seem to want to hurt anyone.
That is where we are going to end part one of this two-parter on Ghosts of the British Isles. As we said, we have another one coming up on Wednesday that is essentially a standalone, so there are options. And in the meantime, I have listener mail about another scary thing from this year, which was Carlos Gesualdo. Who is scarier than many other things. This is from our listener, Anne, who writes, "Hi, Holly and Tracy. Being a music teacher, I knew somewhat of what I was in for when I saw Carlos Gesualdo's name in my podcast list. My first experience with him, however, was in high school. My high school choir did a European tour, and when we had the opportunity to go to a performance at the Vienna State Opera House, I went. We had standing room tickets for a modern opera called Gesualdo, all in German, so I had no clue what they were singing, and the music was really weird to my teenage ears. The only thing I remember is the ending, where there is a murder and then all these dolls are swinging back and forth on giant swings on the stage, with lots of red ribbons representing blood. Lo and behold, 2 years later, I am sitting in Music History 1 as a college freshman music major, and the composer, Carlos Gesualdo, comes up, and the professor told us a little about him. Finally, the opera kind of made a little bit of sense. Sort of. Anyway, I enjoyed being reminded of the weirdness and learning a little more in depth than we were able to in a college class. Attached for your viewing pleasure is my most recent pick of my 2 cats, and I think it captures them perfectly. Aaron Purr is the goofy orange tabby and white laying on his back in the crack between the top of the futon and the wall, and Merlin is the floofy boy on the windowsill with the look of utter disdain on his face. This is the scene that greeted me when I walked in the door after work the other day. Thanks for all you do. Stuff You Missed in History Class is one of my favorite podcasts and probably one I've listened to the longest, at least 14 or 15 years. I got my PhD back when there weren't nearly so many back episodes to catch up on. Thanks again, Anne. Anne, I love this. Your babies look so cute. Also, just the fact that, one, you have a cat named Aaron Purr, which is brilliant, and that you describe him as a goofy orange tabby and white. I feel like you don't have to use the adjective goofy. Orange cats kind of come with that as part of the package most of the time.
Yeah, it seems almost standard behavior.
If one of our listeners has a very stoic and intellectual orange tabby, please write in, because
yeah, I was going to say
we just need the data collection.
an oddly smart orange tabby.
I think they exist. I believe. It just seems that the majority are like doop-a-doop-a-doop in the best way. I love them. I have never had one personally, and it's on my wish list. So if you would like to write to us and share your stories about your encounters with weird opera or your kitties or anything else, you can do so at historypodcast@iHeartRadio.com. You can also subscribe to the show if you like. It is easy as pie to do on the iHeartRadio app or anywhere you listen to your favorite shows.
Stuff You Missed in History Class is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.